From commanding our troops to handling foreign affairs, the role of a U.S. president is no small task. To combat the throat-drying pressure and stress, presidents often unwind by sipping their favorite drink. However, there is no one go-to drink for all presidents. Here's what each preferred. While you might think Sir George Washington was a rather sophisticated man who would have hobbies like golfing and reading, he actually loved his beer just like anyone else, particularly dark porters, which were a drink he would distill and make himself in his Virginia estate near Mount Vernon. It seems Washington had a deep appreciation for porters above all else, and a chilled cup was something you would always see in his office. John Adams, on the other hand, was an apple cider connoisseur of sorts. He always talked about his passion for the drink at great length in his letters to friends, family, and acquaintances alike. You would think a man who could have the finest cup of wine or whiskey at the drop of a hat would have a more extravagant pick, but sometimes the simple things in life make you the happiest. Speaking of the flashy and the grand, Thomas Jefferson could not do without his beloved Italian wines. It was known that Thomas was a fan of both red and white wines, with a slight preference for the red. He would have stocks of vintage wines from the freshest vineyards you could get in Italy, bottles that were aged as long as he had been alive. If you had the wallet of a president, would you not like to have your very own wine collection? James Madison had a pretty similar appreciation for wine and champagne, though he loved to pair it up with a cold glass of whiskey too. He would often be found browsing through his many thousands of books, which was impressive even for a president, with champagne in hand. James Monroe probably took his love for wine the farthest. You know, a lot of people would opt for getting souvenirs or hitting up tourist spots when they find themselves in France, but a president on political visits chooses to go importing thousands of bottles of French wine instead. Looks like when there are no restraints, people's love of wine can go far beyond what you would expect. John Quincy also had a deep appreciation for a very specific kind of wine, Madeira, which is a classic American favorite. It is said that the forefathers were toasting with and emptying bottles of the stuff, so it only makes sense if the sixth president pays for his patriotic recipes with a fresh bottle too. Andrew Jackson liked to keep it simple and kept it to his roots as an American. You can go all over the world and find the freshest wines, champagnes, and most exotic cocktails the planet has to offer, and if you bleed blue, red, and white, then nothing will hit as good as a glass of whiskey. A belief that Jackson carried throughout his entire presidency, as well as a fully filled flask. Martin Van Buren was cut from the same cloth so that he could really handle his whiskey. In fact, the man had a tolerance notorious enough to earn him the nickname Blue Whiskey Van, both for his inhuman liver and his love of blue whiskey. Guess old habits are hard to kill, especially when they buzz you up in a few glasses. William Harry Harrison and John Adams would have probably gotten fairly well, and we even have a conversation starter for them. Do not underestimate the connections that a shared love for a drink can create between two upstanding gentlemen, especially when we are talking about hard cider. While it has gone a bit out of style these days, it seems it has a track record with presidents. John Tyler and his wine parties were a sight to see whenever you would go by the White House. And if you were lucky enough to be attending the kinds of French wines they would serve, they were immaculate. Both his wife and him seemed to share a mutual hobby for collecting and trying out different wines, and he even wrote to his daughter at one point about how much he loved the drink. James K. Polk was never really that heavy of a drinker, like some of the rest on our list. Of course, he dabbled in a few sips here and there to take the edge off like everyone else, but you would not find him plastered and properly hammered. Still, despite his moderation while he was in the White House, its cellars were always chock full of fine wine. Zachary Taylor, on the other hand, probably had the healthiest history with drinking compared to any of us, presidents or not. Give the man a fresh glass of milk, and he would be ready to get up and lead the country, which we are not sure if that is a statement about the properties of milk or a craving that was only severe enough in Zachary. However, Zachary looked good in comparison to most of us, except perhaps Millard Fillmore. The man would never be seen with a drink of any kind besides water, and he would always top himself off with a glass whenever you would see him. It kind of made sense since his skin was way too young for a man of his age, but that goes to show that you should never skimp out on your hydration. The 14th president, Franklin Pierce, had a strong affinity for all kinds of alcohol. He never had a preferred drink that would preside over the others in terms of taste. But from scotches and brandies to vodkas with no chasers, the president could certainly drink. Maybe his terms were particularly stressful, even by president standards? James Buchanan loved his whiskey and wine, but whether he could handle them as much as he consumed them remains a matter of debate. We would see him walking around, stumbling a little, just a tad bit tipsy or more, and we would also see a pretty sizable collection of wines of all kinds. You would think he would build up a tolerance, right? Abraham Lincoln was president during one of the most tumultuous times in American history, so it makes sense that he in particular worked long hours and even longer nights. What got him through it was just water, black coffee, and milk, as typical as it could get, but sometimes that is all you need to get through a tough work week. Andrew Johnson probably could have benefited from one glass less and a bit more, following in Lincoln's notes with his water intake. His speech at the president's inauguration seemed to show that despite how much he loved his whiskey and getting his drink on at parties, he was not half as good as handling his liquor. Civil War generals and whiskey go together like peanut butter and bread, but Ulysses S. Grant in particular was fond of binging on some Old Crow whiskey. Most people in high-ranking political seats took to champagne more than crude brands like that, but he liked to keep it honest and to the point with his drinking. No top notes, middle notes, and fancy flavors, just plain old swill that gets you drunk. Maybe Rutherford B. Hayes did sneak in a drink every now and then, but under the eagle eye of his wife Lucy, it seems he was on a lemonade-only diet. She would have the drink served in the White House over alcohol and always seemed to have a bit of a distaste for it, and we guess that it grew on Mr. Hayes over time too. An account from Rutherford B. Hayes' Presidential Library and Museums tells us that James Garfield loved beer and drank almost nothing else, which props to him, he had the world of alcohol at his disposal and stuck to his roots. Nothing like a cold one with good company to get you through the day. Chester A. Arthur loved to dabble in every kind of drink he could find. He was a pretty firm believer in variety over favoritism, and you could find a vast arsenal of whiskeys, gins, vodkas, and more in the White House when he was in charge. If you have the freedom to, why not explore? Grover Cleveland was a massive fan of all things beer. Not just the drink itself, the large beer jugs or cups you would get them in, late-night trips to the bar, drinking competitions with friends, and bar culture as a whole. We like to think that the idea of going to get a few beers has evolved from just grabbing a drink to becoming a social activity. Grover's relationship with the drink certainly testifies to that. Benjamin Harrison and his high tea parties were a casual delight for all White House staff and residents, and he was one of the few presidents who swore off alcoholic beverages entirely. The why of the matter escapes us even now, but what we do know for a fact is that he was very serious about his afternoon tea. William McKinley is one of the few presidents who has a cocktail named after him, complete with a unique recipe. The McKinley Delight was a whiskey mix that was made with rye whiskey, cherry liquor, absinthe, and vermouth, and it was commonly associated with William's campaigns during his presidential run. It is said that after a long, hard day of work that stretched well into the night, he would sit back and unwind with a fresh glass of the stuff. With a name like Theodore Roosevelt and a history of rough and stern campaigns, you would think that he could down a pint or gallon of whiskey or scotch without any worries. However, he was actually a light drinker, and he prided himself on the fact, to the point that he sued a newspaper for claiming that he was a heavy drinker, which was a case he won. What Roosevelt did enjoy were mint juleps every now and then. Maybe it's a secret White House detox routine? William Howard Taft was probably one of the biggest health freaks to ever sit in the president's chair in the White House. Whatever little alcohol or soda he did consume, he would ban from his life effectively immediately if his doctor so much as implied it. That's some real dedication to your gut health, and that is certainly a habit we can respect. But even the most disciplined presidents have their weaknesses, and Taft's was persimmon beer. Woodrow Wilson was very fond of Scotch whiskey, and it was often reported that he would be carrying around bottles of high-end brands that would normally run you several thousands of dollars for a glass at any premium bar. One of the perks of presidential duties is a massive library of all things alcoholic, though, and Woodrow loved to spend time browsing through the collection. The scandal surrounding Warren G. Harding's love of whiskey has been a pretty spicy topic as far as White House rumors go. Word is, he used to sneak in bootleg liquor taken right from the Justice Department's seized stash. Now, we have all gone pretty far for a drink before, especially when times were tough, but maybe that's overdoing it a little? Despite Calvin Coolidge serving during the Prohibition, which famously banned alcohol, he did not seem to agree with the sentiment too much. He loved his Tokay wine after all, and he would get pretty well acquainted with the Hungarian wine behind closed doors. No paparazzi to disturb your private time with those first sweet sips, right? Herbert Hoover had a pretty alcoholic palate as far as presidents go. While you have some getting whiskeys named after them, and others only enjoying the finest of French distilleries, Herbert chose to keep it on the down low with a tame dry martini. At best, he would just mix in some vermouth to dilute the gin. This is one president that actually abided by prohibition, it seems. Franklin D. Roosevelt was pretty popular since he was the one that put an end to the prohibition. Americans do not play about their bacon, cheese, or their beer, so as the president that finally set the record right, he enjoyed a lot of public love. Unfortunately, that did not extend to the reviews of his custom-made martinis. Gin, absinthe, and vermouth in strange quantities were mixed together and served to his guests, all of whom agreed that it was a pretty mid-drink. Harry S. Truman firmly believed in both direct leadership and simple, straightforward drinking. He liked his whiskey old-fashioned, which is a cocktail that has been in the halls of alcoholic fame for a while now. He also had a preference for being served his at extra strength, since apparently one big no-no with old-fashioned whiskeys was making it too sweet. Dwight D. Eisenhower was a firm believer in the power of Scotch and how it can set the record straight on a bad day, or take a regular day from good to great. Afternoon drinking, late-night sips, and evening sessions were all too common for the president, especially at his parties. John F. Kennedy was a big fan of mixing his drinks and served all kinds of brand new cocktails and drinks that were a bit forgotten at his parties. He definitely brought Bloody Marys and Heineken back into style after they had largely disappeared from the drinking scene outside of frat parties. Lyndon B. Johnson, on the other hand, loved his Fresca so much that he installed a button in his office for Coca-Cola's latest dive into sodas. When he would press the button, a staff member whose job was specifically getting him another cup would have to top him off. That's some real dedication to your favorite soda brand. Richard Nixon was a big fan of highbrow red wine, and the cellars would be filled to the brim during his run as a president. Even before that, during the time he spent as a candidate, you could sometimes find Nixon with a Chateau Margaux bottle reserved for him at the 21 Club in New York, which he frequented. Gerald Ford probably loved martinis more than anyone else on this list could claim to. In fact, he consumed so many of them at one point that the White House staff had to ask him to dial it back down to non-liver-destroying levels. After all, the country still needed him to finish his term before he drank himself into oblivion or worse. Speaking of presidents who had more of a watchful eye on their health, Jimmy Carter always stood by his belief that a cold glass of water at regular intervals in the day is better than any drink you could find behind a counter. Maybe he just never had a good gin and tonic. Or maybe he really did swear off of alcohol. Either way, people were not feeling his sentiment since alcoholic consumption was back in full swing in the 70s and 80s. Ronald Reagan hosted the most lavish parties during his presidency, and you could always find a hefty serving of premium imported wine whenever you would go. One of his hobbies as president was going around California and sampling the many wineries in the state. So safe to say he probably enjoyed wine-tasting parties after his retirement. George Bush brought vodka martinis back into style when he said no to the traditional gin-based mix, opting for vodka like the old days instead. Before gin became the popular thing to use in a martini, vodka would always be the base, and it seems Bush was nostalgic for those times. Bill Clinton was another president who enjoyed custom drinks as he made a concoction known as the snake bite, which was equal parts lager and cider. You could not really find this drink served at most bars, so if you wanted to make it, you would have to do it yourself or ask the bartender. That is to say, just purchasing a bottle was not really an option. Looks like even presidents have to go out of their way when faced with the dominating trends of the ages. Unlike Daddy Dearest, his son, George W. Bush would enjoy non-alcoholic beverages both during his term and after. He quit drinking sometime in the 80s, and ever since then has always enjoyed 0% alcohol content in whatever he's sipping on, which, to be fair, kudos to him and his gut. Obama frequently explored the craft brew scene that was slowly growing in America, and he was often seen making his own brews as well. He tried many kinds of beers, and the ones he made got some pretty positive reviews from the White House staff and his friends and family. Maybe he had a knack for it. You might be worried that our presidents may drink themselves into an early grave, but with Donald Trump, you have to worry more about Diet Coke than any 100-year-old whiskey or red wine. The man has his own Diet Coke button installed in the Oval Office, and he drinks around 12 cans a day. Even for a young person, that's enough to upset your stomach at least once or twice. If anything, his immune system's tenacity should at least be appreciated. Joe Biden, on the other hand, could never really let go of his love of orange Gatorade, despite how old he's getting. Sleepy Joe seems to really prefer the citrus notes, and as far as retired 70-something-year-old presidents and their drinking habits go, if this list is any indication, we have seen worse. With that, we close the tasty chapter on each president's favorite drink. What do you prefer from our list? Let us know, like, subscribe, and let's keep these memories alive.